The R-4 was the first production helicopter in history. Sikorsky delivered the initial batch to the United States Army Air Forces in 1944, and from the moment pilots climbed into the cockpit, it was clear that the machine and the men flying it were learning at the same time. The R-4 had no stability in the hover. Any gust of wind, any overcorrection on the cyclic, and the aircraft would begin to oscillate in a way that demanded immediate and precise response from a pilot who had never flown anything like it before. There were no manuals worth following, no instructors with real experience, and no margin for error. Training accidents were not exceptions, they were expected. When the H-19 entered service in 1950, the Army believed it had finally produced a helicopter that could be trusted. It was larger than anything before it and powerful enough for real utility work. Pilots disagreed almost immediately. The transmission system ran hot under sustained load, and in field conditions, the warning signs were easy to miss until it was too late. Engine fires were not theoretical. They happened during routine operations and training flights. The hover was unstable in crosswinds, and the controls required constant physical correction that fatigued pilots on longer sorties. The H-19 trained a generation of helicopter crews. Many of them spent years wondering when the machine beneath them was going to stop cooperating. The Soviet Union watched the Korean War and understood that the Americans had found something useful in the helicopter. The Mi-4 was the Soviet answer. A large piston-engine transport that entered service in 1952 and was sent everywhere the Red Army needed it. The aircraft worked. It carried troops, evacuated casualties, and supplied remote positions. But the transmission was its permanent weak point. Under sustained load in hot conditions, it ran hot and rough, and Soviet maintenance crews developed an informal familiarity with transmission failures that no official document fully captured. It was reliable enough to fly. It was never reliable enough to relax. The Ka-15 was the Soviet Navy's first purpose-built shipboard helicopter, entering service in 1956 on vessels barely large enough to carry it. Kamov's coaxial rotor design eliminated the tail rotor and kept the aircraft compact, but the handling characteristics made shipboard operations exceptionally demanding. In calm conditions, the Ka-15 was manageable. In wind, and naval operations rarely happen in calm conditions, the aircraft became extremely sensitive to gusts across the deck, requiring precise and immediate correction. Soviet naval aviators described the Ka-15 as an aircraft that was extremely sensitive to wind on ship decks, punishing inattention in the kind of conditions that ships routinely operate in. Britain licensed the Sikorsky H-19 and built it as the Whirlwind, which should have given the Royal Navy and RAF a capable utility helicopter. Instead, they received all of the original aircraft's problems, plus one of their own. The Rolls-Royce Gnome engine installed in early British variants proved significantly less reliable than the American power plant it replaced. It ran rough, it ran hot, and it had a tendency toward power loss at moments that left pilots with very limited options. Royal Navy crews operating from ships found themselves flying an aircraft whose engine they did not fully trust over water, with no realistic emergency alternative. The Americans eventually fixed the H-19. The British fixed the Whirlwind by replacing the engine with something else entirely. The H-21 arrived in Vietnam in 1962 as one of the first American helicopters committed to the war, and the country immediately exposed everything the aircraft could not do. The tandem rotor design had earned the nickname Flying Banana from its curved fuselage, and in temperate conditions, it performed adequately. Vietnam was not temperate. In the heat and humidity of Southeast Asia, the H-21 lost lift at precisely the moments it needed it most. Heavily loaded in hot weather over jungle terrain, the aircraft struggled to climb and struggled to accelerate. Pilots learned to calculate loads conservatively and accept that the machine had a ceiling well below what the specifications suggested. It was a helicopter that taught pilots to plan carefully for the possibility it might not do what they needed. The HH-43 used an intermeshing rotor design, two rotors crossing over each other without a tail rotor, and the handling characteristics were unlike anything pilots had trained on. Transitioning to the Husky required relearning reflexes built over hundreds of hours. The pedal inputs controlling yaw worked in reverse logic to what pilots expected, and power response during hover demanded a different touch than anything in the standard training syllabus. The aircraft was used extensively for crash rescue at air bases across Southeast Asia, which meant pilots flew it under pressure when there was no margin for mistakes. It worked. It saved lives. The pilots who flew it also spent considerable time warning newcomers that the first hours in the Husky were going to feel deeply wrong. The CH-37 was the largest helicopter in the American inventory when it entered service in 1956, and Sikorsky's solution to engine placement was to mount them in sponsons on either side of the fuselage. This kept the cabin clear and the design elegant on paper. In operation, the sponson-mounted engines created persistent problems with heat management and fire risk that maintenance crews and pilots both learned to take seriously. Engine fires in the CH-37 were not theoretical events described in emergency checklists. They happened often enough that pilots developed informal procedures for managing a machine that might decide to burn at any point in the flight. Few of the crews who flew it argued that its replacement by the CH-47 had come too soon. The AH-1G entered combat in Vietnam in 1967 as the Army's first purpose-built attack helicopter, and in the conditions it was designed for, it was effective. The problem was that Vietnam rarely provided those conditions. In lowland heat at high humidity, heavily loaded with weapons and fuel, the Cobra's single Lycoming T-53 engine struggled to deliver what the mission required. Pilots flying fire support in the Mekong Delta found the aircraft would not hold altitude in a loaded hover, and that attack runs had to be planned around the available power margin. Army after-action reports documented these performance limitations specifically. The later twin-engine variants fixed most of the problems. The pilots who flew the early Cobras knew the limitations in detail because the aircraft reminded them regularly. The CH-46A entered Marine Corps service in 1964, and within 2 years of combat operations in Vietnam, it had accumulated a record that no manufacturer would have chosen. The transmission was unreliable under sustained combat loads. The engines ingested dust and lost power. In 1967, a series of structural failures, the aft pylons separating in flight, killed multiple crews and grounded the entire fleet. Marine pilots who flew the CH-46 in Vietnam later described a learning curve that was deadly, with mechanical shortcomings that became apparent quickly in combat conditions. 6 aircraft lost their aft pylons before engineers identified whirl mode flutter as the cause. The Marines called it the Frog, flew it for 50 years, and modified it continuously. The early versions were machines crews flew with a specific awareness of what they might do without warning. On March 12, 1969, Lockheed test pilot David Beale took the third AH-56 Cheyenne prototype over the California coast at 190 knots. The main rotor blades began oscillating vertically, an instability the program had been working to eliminate for months. The oscillations grew until the blades struck the tail boom and the cockpit simultaneously. Beale was killed instantly. The Army's investigation confirmed that the rigid rotor system had a resonance problem that had not been solved despite multiple design changes, and the production contract was cancelled 2 months later. The Cheyenne was a remarkable aircraft, faster than anything else in its class, armed more heavily than anything that had flown before it. The rigid rotor that gave it its performance also gave it a failure mode that no pilot could survive. The Mi-2 was a small twin-turbine helicopter built in Poland under Soviet license from the mid-1960s, used by nearly every Warsaw Pact air arm for training and light utility work. Soviet and Polish instructors who flew it extensively developed a consistent description of its handling. The cyclic was extraordinarily sensitive, responding to inputs that would have been negligible in any other aircraft. Pilots coming from the Mi-4 or fixed-wing backgrounds found the Mi-2's responses startling. A touch too much input, and the aircraft moved sharply. A correction applied too firmly, and the oscillation began. Instructors called it nervous. Students called it unforgiving. It was the aircraft on which a generation of Warsaw Pact pilots learned the difference between flying precisely and flying well. The Kr-25 entered Soviet naval aviation in 1965 as a shipboard anti-submarine helicopter, bringing with it a coaxial rotor system that solved the space problem on Soviet warships, but created a different problem in the cockpit. Pilots transitioning from conventional single-rotor helicopters encountered a control system whose logic was not entirely familiar. The absence of a tail rotor changed the yaw response, and the coaxial configuration produced handling characteristics that had to be learned specifically rather than transferred from prior experience. Soviet naval aviators operated the Kr-25 in North Atlantic conditions from small ship decks in weather that challenged any aircraft. Those who flew it for extended periods became competent in it. Those new to it found the early hours among the more demanding of their careers. The Mi-6 was the largest production helicopter in the world when it entered service in 1959, and everything about flying it was scaled to match. At maximum takeoff weight, the aircraft had inertia that pilots described as flying a building. Inputs took time to produce results, corrections arrived after the moment they were needed, and physical demands on the crew during long sorties were substantial. The Mi-6 used stub wings to offload the rotor in cruise flight, which helped with range, but added another variable to manage during transitions between hover and forward flight. Soviet military records from the 1960s and 1970s document a pattern of incidents involving heavy transport helicopters where crews misjudged the aircraft's response, a pattern the Mi-6's handling contributed to directly. The Mi-10 was a flying crane, a conventional rotor system mounted on 4 long legs designed to straddle outsized cargo, lift it, and carry it where it was needed. The concept worked. The execution required pilots to perform one of the most demanding tasks in helicopter operations, landing on a precise point while looking through a glass panel in the floor at a load they could not directly see, guided by a ground controller whose instructions arrived with a delay that the aircraft's inertia made unforgiving. Soviet crews who flew the Mi-10 on construction missions described the hover and land sequence under load as a procedure that demanded total concentration and left no capacity for anything else. The Mi-10 was effective. It was also the kind of aircraft that pilots flew with sustained mental effort that other machines did not require. The Mi-12 was the largest helicopter ever built. 2 pairs of rotors mounted on outriggers, a maximum takeoff weight of over 105 tons, a fuselage wider than most transport aircraft. Mill built 2 flying prototypes in the late 1960s and set world payload records that have never been broken. The test pilots who flew it described the handling in terms that conveyed scale rather than precision. The aircraft responded to inputs slowly, accumulated momentum in ways that required anticipation rather than reaction, and demanded that pilots think several seconds ahead of where the machine was at any moment. One description that circulated in Soviet aviation circles was that flying the Mi-12 was less like piloting an aircraft and more like steering something that had already decided where it was going. The CH-54 was the American flying crane, and its defining operational challenge was the precision landing under load. The Tahe was designed with a rear-facing pilot station specifically for load work. The pilot sat backwards, looking down and aft through a window at the load below, talking to a ground guide, attempting to place tons of suspended cargo onto a precise point, while managing an aircraft that responded with the lag that weight and rotor inertia produce. Army pilots who flew the CH-54 in Vietnam, lifting artillery pieces and downed aircraft from jungle terrain, described the reverse seat landing as a procedure unlike anything else in military aviation. It required spatial awareness that had to be developed specifically for this aircraft and this task. The Tahe was respected. It was not flown casually. The early CH-47 variants that entered service in the mid-1960s had a vibration problem that was structural rather than incidental. The tandem rotor system produced resonance frequencies that transmitted through the airframe and into everything connected to it. Bolts worked loose. Components fatigued faster than service intervals anticipated. Several early aircraft were lost when structural failures resulted from vibration damage that had accumulated over time. Army crews in Vietnam flew the Chinook hard. Heavy loads, high temperatures, sustained operations, and the maintenance burden the vibration problem created was constant. The crews who flew the early CH-47s knew the aircraft's tendencies in the way that people learn the tendencies of something they cannot entirely predict, and they managed accordingly. The CH-53A was the most powerful helicopter in the Western world when it entered service in 1966, and its capability came with physical demands that pilots felt across the length of every mission. The controls were heavy, not difficult to move, but requiring sustained physical effort that accumulated over hours. Vibration in the early variants was significant, a continuous, low-frequency transmission through the airframe that fatigued crews on long overwater transits or extended combat operations. Marine Corps pilots who flew the CH-53 in Vietnam described it as an aircraft that required physical fitness as a professional requirement. It performed what was asked of it. It also asked something back from every pilot who sat in it for more than 2 hours. The Mi-8 became the most widely produced helicopter in history, and in most conditions it was reliable and capable. Afghanistan changed the assessment. Soviet crews flying the Mi-8 in the mountains of Afghanistan from 1979 onward encountered a combination of high altitude, heat, and operational loading that pushed the aircraft beyond the envelope it was designed for. At altitude, the engines lost power. Heavily loaded for combat resupply or casualty evacuation, the aircraft struggled to climb and could not hover out of ground effect. Soviet after-action reports from the Afghan campaign document a sustained pattern of performance limitations that forced crews to recalculate loads and profiles constantly, accepting margins that pilots in lower altitude theaters would never have considered. The Mi-8 was a good helicopter that Afghanistan turned into a difficult one. The Mi-24 was one of the most feared combat helicopters ever built. Its combination of heavy armor, substantial weapons load, and troop carrying capacity made it unique, and Soviet designers were proud of what they had created. The pilots who flew it into combat had a more specific set of concerns. The tandem cockpit arrangement placed the pilot above and behind the weapons officer, and the armored glass and cockpit framing that protected both crew members also severely restricted forward and downward visibility. In the mountains of Afghanistan, where terrain came up fast and low-level flight demanded awareness of everything below and ahead, this was not an abstract limitation. It was the primary tactical problem with the aircraft. The Mi-24 was formidable. The pilots who flew it in combat knew exactly what it could not show them. The Wessex entered Royal Navy service in 1961 as a license-built version of the Sikorsky S-58, but Westland replaced the original piston engine with a Rolls-Royce Gnome turboshaft that changed the aircraft's handling characteristics in ways that took time to understand. The Gnome was powerful, but had a throttle response that pilots described as either on or off, with a transition between the two states that was rapid and demanding to manage. In auto-rotation, the procedure used to land safely following engine failure, the Wessex required precise timing and technique that was less forgiving than comparable aircraft. Royal Navy crews operating from ships in the North Atlantic flew the Wessex in conditions that tested everything the aircraft had, and the engine's response characteristics were a permanent feature of crew training. The pilots understood its specific demands. They also never forgot they were there. The Sea King gave the Royal Navy a genuine all-weather search and rescue capability, and it served for decades with crews who valued what it could do. The difficulty was in the cockpit during complex operations. The Sea King's anti-submarine and SAR fit was among the most demanding avionics loads of its era, and the pilot workload during genuine emergencies, North Sea rescues, Falklands combat operations, was high enough that crew fatigue became an operational consideration. Pilots flying night rescues in deteriorating weather managed navigation, systems monitoring, hoist operations, and fuel state simultaneously with a workload that had few equivalents in military aviation. It was an aircraft that rewarded training and punished shortcuts. The men who flew it in the most demanding conditions would not have chosen another aircraft. They would also have told you exactly what flying it cost them. The Tiger entered service in the early 2000s with the French, German, and Australian armies as one of the most technologically advanced attack helicopters in the world. The glass cockpit gave crews more information than any previous generation of helicopter pilots had access to. It also generated heat at a rate the environmental control system could not consistently manage. German and Australian crews flying the Tiger in hot conditions, desert exercises, Middle Eastern deployments, reported cockpit temperatures reaching levels that made sustained concentration difficult. Australian Army Aviation documented the issue formally, and it became the subject of modification programs. The Tiger was sophisticated. The pilots who flew early production variants in warm climates wore cooling vests as standard equipment, because the aircraft they were flying was not yet able to keep up with the environment it had been sent into. The NH-90 was a multinational program producing a medium utility helicopter whose fly-by-wire flight control system was genuinely advanced. It was also a system delivered to operators before development was complete. Pilots flying early NH-90 variants described a flight control system they did not entirely trust. Not because it failed dramatically, but because its behavior was not always predictable in the way that mature systems are. The handling problems were serious enough that France and Germany pursued legal action against NH Industries over performance shortfalls that had not been resolved at delivery. Several nations requested modifications to control response and hover characteristics that the original software had not delivered satisfactorily. The NH-90 eventually matured into a capable and widely operated aircraft. The pilots who received the earliest examples were, in a practical sense, completing the development program that should have been finished before they got it. The HMS Captain represented Victorian ambition gone wrong. British Admiralty reports noted the turret ship's dangerously low freeboard, just 6.5 feet above water. Engineering logs documented repeated warnings from Chief Constructor Edward Reed about stability margins. The ship's designer, Captain Cooper Coles, dismissed these concerns and sailed aboard to prove critics wrong. On September 7, 1870, Captain capsized in a moderate gale off Cape Finisterre. 473 men drowned, including Coles. The Royal Navy had ordered sister ships, but crews refused to serve aboard them. The official inquiry concluded the design was fundamentally flawed. The sisters were never completed. The Union's revolutionary ironclad became a coffin for her crew long before she sank. The innovative turret design created an airtight hull that trapped heat and moisture. Temperatures below decks regularly exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Ventilation was nearly non-existent. Sailors reported constant seasickness from the vessel's violent rolling in even moderate seas. The lower decks flooded regularly, creating a fetid swamp. 50 crew members died from heat exhaustion, disease, and accidents during the ship's brief career. When Monitor finally sank in a storm off Cape Hatteras in December 1862, 16 more died. The survivors described their service aboard as worse than Confederate prison camps. The Russian Navy's circular Popovka ironclads defied naval architecture and common sense. These two ships were literally round, flat-bottomed discs with a single central turret. The design was supposed to create a stable gun platform. It created rotating nightmares instead. The vessels spun uncontrollably in any current or wind. Crews reported constant disorientation and seasickness from the perpetual rotation. Steering required constant helm adjustments that rarely worked. The ships achieved fame as the worst handling warships ever built. Russian sailors called them Admiral Popov's mistake. Both spent most of their careers moored as floating batteries because taking them to sea was an exercise in futility. The Royal Navy's K-class submarines were steam-powered death traps. The concept, high-speed fleet submarines using steam turbines, ignored the fundamental problem that steam and submersion don't mix. The boats required complex systems to seal the boiler uptakes before diving. These systems failed regularly. 6 K-class boats sank, killing hundreds of submariners. The Battle of May Island in 1918 saw 2 K-boats collide with friendly ships in darkness, killing 105 men. Survivors reported constant terror from the temperamental boilers and flooding risks. The class earned the nickname Calamity Class. British submariners considered assignment to K-boats a death sentence. The Italian Navy's Ram ironclad was supposed to sink enemy ships through ramming attacks. Instead, she nearly sank herself in harbour. The vessel's extreme forward overhang created instability in any weather. During a minor storm while moored in Ancona, Affondatore took on water through deck hatches. The crew watched helplessly as their ship settled to the harbour bottom. She was raised, but the damage to crew confidence was permanent. Italian sailors reported the ship felt unstable even in calm waters. The radical ram design created dangerous weight distribution that naval architects hadn't properly calculated. Affondatore spent most of her career as a harbour-bound training vessel because taking her to sea was too risky. The heavy cruiser earned her nickname honestly. Minnie St. Misery reflected conditions that made her the most hated ship in the US Navy's Pacific Fleet. The vessel rolled violently in moderate seas, making even routine tasks hazardous. Crew quarters were cramped and poorly ventilated. The ship's ventilation system failed to manage tropical heat, creating unbearable conditions below decks. Sailors reported constant seasickness from the ship's motion characteristics. The cruiser's plumbing frequently backed up, creating sanitation nightmares. Transfer from Minneapolis-St. Paul was considered a promotion, regardless of the new assignment. Navy personnel records show the ship had the worst retention rate in the fleet. The Royal Navy's battlecruiser was fast and powerful, but miserable to inhabit. The ship's crew spaces were inadequate for her complement. During World War I operations, Tiger's crew lived on reduced rations, while the ship's officers maintained comfortable quarters. This disparity created resentment that manifested in poor morale. The vessel's high speed created severe vibration throughout the hull. Crew quarters were located in areas most affected by machinery noise and vibration. Sailors reported inability to sleep during high-speed operations. The ship's ventilation was inadequate, creating oppressive conditions in warm waters. British naval records show Tiger had chronic discipline problems stemming from the poor living conditions her crew endured. Germany's revolutionary submarines were rushed into production with catastrophic results. The advanced boats featured new battery systems that proved dangerously unstable, Battery fires occurred regularly, filling the confined spaces with toxic fumes. The rushed construction meant many systems were poorly installed or simply didn't work. Crews reported constant leaks and mechanical failures. The boat's advanced features became liabilities when they malfunctioned. The Type 21's schnorkel system often failed, forcing dangerous surface operations. Allied bombing of German shipyards meant spare parts were unavailable. Crews served aboard boats they knew were defective. Only 2 Type 21 boats completed war patrols. Crews privately called them death traps with advanced technology. The British escort carrier converted from a merchantman became a floating bomb. The conversion process created dangerous fuel storage arrangements. Aviation gasoline vapors accumulated in poorly ventilated spaces. The ship's crew repeatedly reported concerns about fire risk. The Admiralty dismissed these warnings. On March 27, 1943, Dasher exploded in the Firth of Clyde. The blast was so violent that the ship sank in minutes. 149 crew members died. Survivors reported they had expected disaster. The explosion was ruled accidental, but investigations revealed the dangerous design created by hasty conversion. The disaster validated every concern the crew had raised. Japan's submarine aircraft carriers were engineering marvels and habitability nightmares. The massive boats were designed to carry 3 float planes while maintaining submarine capabilities. This required enormous size, over 400 feet long, but still housed 200 men in submarine-sized spaces. The crew quarters were impossibly cramped. Ventilation was inadequate for the subtropical operations these boats were designed for. The aircraft hangar created moisture problems throughout the vessel. Crews reported constant dampness and mold. The combination of size and slow diving time made the boats vulnerable to attack. Japanese submariners considered I-400 assignment a hardship posting. The boat's complexity created maintenance nightmares that crews struggled to manage with limited resources. The Navy's experimental dynamite gunboat featured 3 pneumatic guns that fired explosive shells using compressed air instead of gunpowder. The concept was innovative. The execution was a disaster. The pneumatic system required enormous air compressors that filled the ship with deafening noise. Crew members reported permanent hearing damage from the machinery. The guns themselves proved unreliable, with frequent misfires and pressure failures. The ship's unique weapon system meant spare parts were unavailable. Maintenance required constant improvisation. The Vesuvius spent more time in repair than at sea. The crew's frustration with the experimental weapon system was documented in multiple engineering reports. The Navy never built another pneumatic gunboat. The Royal Navy's Ram torpedo cruiser featured an experimental above-water torpedo system that poisoned her crew. The vessel mounted torpedo tubes that exhausted combustion gases directly into crew spaces. Sailors reported constant respiratory problems from the toxic fumes. The ship's low freeboard meant waves regularly swept the deck, making operations hazardous. The ram bow created severe pitching in any sea state. The vessel's unique design meant crews had no experience maintaining her systems. Polyphemus spent most of her career in harbour because sea operations created unbearable working conditions. British naval records show the ship was essentially experimental, and the crew served as unwilling test subjects for failed technologies. The Soviet Navy's first post-war submarine design combined German Type 21 technology with Soviet manufacturing quality. The result was reliability catastrophe. Early Whiskey-class boats suffered from constant mechanical failures. The diesel engines broke down regularly. The electrical systems were unreliable. Battery explosions occurred with frightening frequency. Soviet submariners reported the boat spent more time under repair than at sea. The propulsion system created excessive noise that made the submarines easily detectable. Crew complaints about the boat's reliability were documented in multiple Soviet naval assessments. The submarine's problems were so severe that later production runs required complete redesigns. Early whiskey crews served aboard boats they knew were dangerously defective. The British battlecruiser underwent 3 major conversions in 8 years, creating mechanical chaos. Originally designed with massive 18-inch guns, Furious was converted to a hybrid carrier, then a full carrier, then modified again. Each conversion created new engineering problems. The propulsion system, designed for the original battlecruiser configuration, struggled with the added weight and wind resistance of flight decks. The modifications created structural stress that caused constant leaks. The ship's hybrid nature meant spare parts were either unavailable or required custom fabrication. Engineering logs documented perpetual breakdowns. Crews reported the vessel spent more time under repair than operational. Furious's mechanical reliability never recovered from the repeated conversions. France's submarine cruiser combined the worst characteristics of both ship types. The enormous boat featured twin 8-inch guns in a pressure-proof turret, a system that never worked properly. The gun mechanisms jammed regularly. The turret leaked constantly. The boat's hybrid design created mechanical complexity that proved impossible to maintain. The diesel engines were unreliable. The complex systems required constant repair, with parts that were often unavailable. French submariners reported Surcouf spent more time being repaired than at sea. The boat's size made it slow to dive, creating vulnerability. The crew's frustration with the vessel's constant failures was well documented in French naval records. Surcouf represented ambitious design, undermined by mechanical reality. Germany's most powerful battleship became a prison for her crew. After brief operations in Norwegian waters, Tirpitz spent years hiding in fjords while Allied bombers attacked relentlessly. The crew lived under constant bombing threat. The ship's mission changed from offensive operations to simply surviving. Sailors watched as British bombers grew more numerous and their attacks more accurate. The crew's morale collapsed as they realized they were serving aboard a target, not a warship. Transfer requests increased dramatically. The ship's isolation in Norwegian fjords meant limited shore leave and no meaningful operations. When Tirpitz was finally sunk by British bombers in November 1944, she had achieved nothing strategically. Her crew had spent years trapped aboard a ship, waiting to die. The Soviet battleship was Italian-built and Russian-hated. Transferred from Italy as war reparations, Giulio Cesare became Novorossiysk in Soviet service. The crew resented serving aboard a foreign-built ship with Italian systems they didn't understand. The vessel's documentation was in Italian, creating maintenance nightmares. Soviet naval standards required modifications that compromised the original design. The crew reported constant mechanical problems stemming from incompatible Soviet and Italian systems. Morale was terrible. The ship's magazines were poorly maintained. In October 1955, Novorossiysk exploded and sank in Sevastopol harbor, killing 608 men. Investigations suggested possible sabotage. The crew's resentment of the ship may have contributed to the lax security that allowed the disaster. The battlecruiser's conversion to aircraft carrier devastated crew morale. Sailors who were trained for battlecruiser operations suddenly found themselves operating aircraft. The conversion was rushed, creating dangerous working conditions. The crew resented the loss of their ship's original identity and capabilities. The vessel's hybrid characteristics, too slow for fleet carriers, too vulnerable for capital ship operations, created an identity crisis that affected morale. Crew members reported feeling they were serving aboard a failed experiment. The ship's loss to German battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau in June 1940 validated every concern the crew had about the conversion. Glorious went down with most of her crew, vindicated in their resentment, but dead nonetheless. The Japanese battleship's crew lived under a cloud of suspicion and fear. Rumors circulated about sabotage threats and internal tensions. The ship's magazine explosion in June 1943 killed 1,121 men and seemed to validate the crew's worst fears. Whether the explosion was accident, sabotage, or structural failure was never definitively determined. But the crew had reported concerns about magazine safety before the disaster. The rumors of internal discontent suggested morale problems that may have contributed to lax safety procedures. Japanese naval investigations were inconclusive. The disaster left surviving crew members traumatized and guilty. Mutsu's loss created a morale crisis across the Imperial Japanese Navy, as crews questioned the safety of their own ships. The Navy collier's crew complained constantly about chronic overloading before the ship vanished. Engineering reports documented concerns that Cyclops was regularly loaded beyond safe limits. The ship's captain, Lieutenant Commander George Worley, had a reputation for poor judgment and overconfidence. Crew members reported the vessel was structurally stressed from excessive cargo weight. The ship disappeared without trace in March 1918, with 306 men aboard. No wreckage was ever found. The Navy officially ruled the loss unexplained, but the crew's documented complaints about overloading suggest they knew the ship was unsafe. Cyclops vanished because someone ignored warnings that should have been heeded. The crew paid for that decision with their lives. The French pre-dreadnought featured extreme tumble-home hull design that created dangerous instability. The ship's sides sloped inward so dramatically that the deck was narrower than the waterline. This created a high center of gravity that made the ship roll violently. Crew members reported constant seasickness and fear during operations. On March 18, 1915, Bouvet struck a mine during the Gallipoli landings. The ship capsized in less than 2 minutes. 710 men died. Only 75 survived. The extreme tumble-home design that crews had feared contributed to the rapid capsizing. French naval assessments after the disaster acknowledged the design's fundamental instability. The crew's fears had been justified, but recognition came too late. The Royal Navy battleship became infamous for a collision caused by an impossible maneuver. Admiral Sir George Tryon ordered Victoria to turn inward toward HMS Camperdown in a maneuver that required more space than available. The crew recognized the order was impossible but couldn't countermand the admiral. Victoria rammed Camperdown and sank within 15 minutes. 358 men died, including Admiral Tryon. The crew's resentment wasn't toward the ship, but toward command decisions that killed them. The disaster created lasting trauma in the Royal Navy about questioning obviously wrong orders. Victoria's crew died knowing the maneuver was impossible but unable to prevent it. The ship became a symbol of command failure rather than design flaw. The Russian flagship featured extreme tumble-home design that created terrifying stability problems. The hull's inward slope of nearly 30 degrees created dangerous rolling characteristics. Crew members reported the ship rolled so violently that working on deck during even moderate seas was life-threatening. The vessel's French-designed tumble-home was even more extreme than Russian standards. During combat at the Battle of the Yellow Sea in August 1904, a Japanese shell killed the ship's captain and jammed the rudder. Cesarevich circled uncontrollably, creating chaos in the Russian battle line. The crew's concerns about the ship's stability were validated in the worst possible way during combat. The extreme design nearly proved fatal to everyone aboard. The Japanese battlecruiser's early service was plagued by severe vibration problems. The ship's high-speed turbines created vibrations that affected every part of the vessel. Crew members reported constant noise and shaking that made sleep nearly impossible. The vibration damaged equipment and created maintenance nightmares. Fire control systems were particularly affected, reducing the ship's combat effectiveness. Japanese naval engineers spent years trying to solve the vibration problem through propeller modifications and structural reinforcements. The crews served aboard ships that shook themselves apart at high speed. The problems were eventually reduced, but never fully eliminated. Congo-class sailors reported the early years were a special kind of hell, as their ships literally vibrated around them. The Italian Navy's heavy cruisers suffered from severe rolling problems that made them miserable at sea. The ship's high metacentric height created quick, sharp rolls that brutalized the crew. Sailors reported constant seasickness and difficulty performing routine tasks. The vessel's excessive rolling affected gunnery accuracy and made flight operations dangerous. Italian naval records document crew complaints about the ship's motion characteristics. The problem stemmed from weight distribution choices made to maximize armor within treaty limits. The Zara class was heavily armored and well armed, but crews hated serving aboard them because of the brutal seakeeping. The ships proved effective in combat, but remained uncomfortable platforms throughout their service lives. F-84 Thunderjet was a handful from the moment pilots strapped in. The J-35 engine's unpredictable surges and chronic fuel leaks meant every takeoff was tense. Vibration rattled the cockpit, and JATO bottle explosions on the ramp were a real threat. The straight wings limited maneuverability, and the aircraft's tendency to stall on approach made landings nerve-wracking. Pilots never fully trusted the Thunderjet, knowing a routine sortie could end in a fireball. F-80 Shooting Star brought jets to the front line, but pilots quickly learned to fear its engine's sudden flameouts. The Allison J-33 could quit without warning, especially at altitude or after rapid throttle changes. The early ejection seat was unreliable, and several fatal training accidents haunted squadrons. Flying the F-80 meant constant anxiety. Every climb, every turn, every landing was shadowed by the possibility of silence and a dead stick. F-94 Starfire was a trainer turned interceptor that felt like a compromise in the cockpit. The heavy radar and rocket pack made the nose sluggish, and pilots struggled with poor visibility and unreliable afterburners. Night and bad weather missions were especially dangerous, with the aircraft prone to sudden stalls and electrical failures. Many pilots dreaded being assigned to the Starfire, knowing it was unforgiving when the weather turned. F-89 Scorpion was a brute of a night fighter, but its size and weight made it slow to respond. The twin engines were notorious for flameouts, and the complex electronics often failed at the worst moments. Pilots reported wing flexing at high speeds and a tendency to wallow in turbulence. The Scorpion's heavy controls and frequent system failures left crews exhausted and wary of every sortie. F-86D Sabre Dog looked like a winner, but its radar and rocket pack brought constant headaches. The added weight and altered aerodynamics made the jet unpredictable on approach, and the fire control system often failed in combat. Pilots complained about sluggish handling and unreliable weapons, especially in bad weather. The Sabre Dog's reputation for sudden, inexplicable malfunctions made it a jet to be endured, not enjoyed. F-84F Thunderstreak promised speed with its swept wings, but the J-65 engine was a pilot's nightmare. Compressor stalls and engine fires were common, and the aircraft's tendency to enter violent spins at high Gs made dogfighting dangerous. Several fatal crashes were linked to structural weaknesses in the wings. Even after upgrades, the Thunderstreak's reputation for sudden, catastrophic failure kept pilots on edge. F-3H Demon was the Navy's first missile fighter, but its underpowered Westinghouse engine made every carrier launch a gamble. The jet struggled to get airborne, and engine failures were frequent. Pilots called it the lead sled for its poor climb and heavy handling. Carrier landings were especially stressful, with the Demon's sluggish response and high sink rate making every approach a test of nerves. MiG-19 was the Soviet Union's first supersonic fighter, but its twin engines had short lifespans and were prone to flameouts. The aircraft was unstable at high speeds and difficult to land safely, with frequent hydraulic failures and a cramped, hot cockpit. Pilots dreaded the MiG-19's unpredictable behavior, knowing that a single misstep could lead to disaster on takeoff or landing. Su-7 was a rugged ground attack jet, but its primitive landing gear collapsed easily on rough fields. The high landing speed and poor low-speed handling made it unflyable from many forward bases. Pilots struggled with limited visibility and unreliable brakes, and the Su-7's accident rate was high. Many crews considered it one of the most unforgiving jets in Soviet service, a machine that punished even minor mistakes. CF-100 Canuck was Canada's all-weather interceptor, but its early models were notorious for icing problems and engine flameouts. Pilots nicknamed it the Widowmaker, after a series of fatal crashes in cold weather. The heavy controls and poor climb rate made recovery from stalls difficult, and the Canuck's reputation for danger in icy conditions lingered long after improvements. Saab 35. Draken introduced a double delta wing for high-speed performance, but pilots faced unique rotation accidents during takeoff. The abrupt pitch-up tendency could cause loss of control if not handled precisely, and early Drakens suffered from unreliable landing gear. Swedish pilots respected its speed, but dreaded the unpredictable takeoff behavior, knowing a split-second error could end in disaster. Northrop F-5A was designed as a lightweight fighter, but its underpowered engines and limited avionics made it a challenge in combat. Pilots reported frequent compressor stalls and poor acceleration, especially at altitude. The F-5A's light construction made it vulnerable to battle damage, and several air forces experienced high crash rates during training. The jet's reputation for being unforgiving in a dogfight stuck with it for years. Hawker Hunter, early, was a British classic, but initial versions suffered from severe compressor stalls and engine surges. Pilots had to manage throttle changes carefully to avoid sudden power loss, and the early ejection seat was unreliable. Several fatal accidents occurred during test flights, and the Hunter's reputation for engine trouble lingered even after upgrades. De Havilland Venom was a British jet fighter bomber with a reputation for engine overheating and fuel leaks. Pilots faced frequent flameouts and fires, especially during ground attack missions. The Venom's limited range and unreliable systems made it unpopular for long sorties. Maintenance crews struggled with persistent oil leaks and difficult engine access, making the Venom a burden for both pilots and ground staff. Mirage 5, early exports, was a ground attack variant of the Mirage 3, but underpowered engines and limited avionics frustrated pilots. The aircraft's poor acceleration and climb rate made it vulnerable in combat. Export customers reported frequent maintenance issues and unreliable weapon systems. Many air forces quickly sought upgrades or replacements, and the early Mirage 5 was rarely a favorite among its crew. Mirage F1, early blocks, introduced a new wing and engine, but pilots encountered engine surges and unreliable afterburners. The aircraft's handling at low speeds was tricky, and several accidents occurred during approach and landing. Early avionics were prone to failure, complicating navigation and targeting. Later blocks improved reliability, but the first Mirage F1s were not well liked by their pilots. J-6, China's MiG-19 copy, inherited all the Soviet original's flaws: short engine life, instability, and poor handling. Chinese pilots reported frequent flameouts and dangerous control issues at high speed. The J-6's limited avionics and unreliable hydraulics made it difficult to fly safely. Despite massive production, few pilots had fond memories of the J-6's demanding flight characteristics. F-7, China's early MiG-21 derivative, was even less popular than the Soviet original. Pilots complained of unreliable engines, poor cockpit visibility, and dangerous low-speed handling. The aircraft's limited range and basic avionics made it unsuitable for modern combat. High accident rates during training and operations led many air forces to retire the F-7 as soon as possible. J-8 Early was China's first indigenous interceptor, but its poor avionics and handling issues frustrated pilots. The aircraft's large size and weak engines made it sluggish in combat. Early radar systems were unreliable, and pilots struggled with limited situational awareness. The J-8's accident rate was high, and improvements came slowly, leaving many crews wary of its performance. Su-9 Fishpot was a Soviet interceptor with poor weapons and limited range. Pilots struggled with unreliable radar and a cramped cockpit. The aircraft's high landing speed and poor low-speed handling made it difficult to operate from many airfields. The Su-9's lack of all-weather capability and frequent system failures led to its quick replacement by more advanced designs. Su-11 was a little-known Soviet interceptor that was quickly cancelled due to persistent technical problems. Pilots faced unreliable engines, poor radar, and difficult handling at high speeds. The aircraft's limited weapons and short range made it ineffective in its intended role. Few Su-11s were built, and most crews were relieved when the type was withdrawn from service. F-8 Crusader was a US Navy carrier fighter known for its maintenance headaches and high accident rate. The variable incidence wing and complex systems required constant attention. Carrier landings were especially hazardous, with many accidents caused by nose gear collapse or hook failures. Pilots respected its dogfighting ability, but dreaded its unpredictable handling on approach, and the "last of the gunfighters" nickname came with a price. MiG-21, Early, was a revolutionary design, but pilots quickly learned to fear its flameouts and poor low-speed performance. The aircraft delta wing made it unforgiving during takeoff and landing, and engine failures were common. The cramped cockpit and limited visibility added to the challenge. Many air forces experienced high accident rates, especially during training, and the MiG-21's reputation for being a flying coffin was well earned. MiG-23 was a swing-wing fighter with a reputation for instability and maintenance nightmares. Pilots struggled with abrupt pitch changes and dangerous spins at low speed. The aircraft's complex variable geometry wings and unreliable avionics led to frequent accidents. Even Soviet pilots preferred the older MiG-21, and the MiG-23's reputation for unpredictability persisted throughout its service. The fear of sudden loss of control haunted every sortie. F-100 Super Sabre was the first US fighter to break the sound barrier in level flight, but pilots called it the Hun for its deadly yaw instability. The aircraft was prone to violent spins and roll coupling, especially during high-speed maneuvers. Accident rates were high, with many losses during takeoff and landing. Later modifications improved safety, but the F-100's reputation for danger never faded. Pilots described flying it as riding a wild horse you couldn't trust. F-111B was intended as the Navy's carrier-based fleet defense fighter, but its overweight design and poor handling doomed it. Pilots struggled with sluggish controls and long takeoff runs, making carrier operations hazardous. The aircraft's complex swing-wing mechanism was prone to failure, and the F-111B was quickly cancelled after repeated accidents and pilot complaints. The sense of relief when the program ended was widespread among carrier aviators. Convair F-2Y Sea Dart was an experimental supersonic seaplane fighter that proved nearly unflyable. Pilots faced violent vibrations and instability during takeoff and landing on water. The hydro-ski design caused the aircraft to bounce uncontrollably, and one prototype broke apart during a test flight. The Sea Dart's dangerous handling and fatal accidents led to its rapid cancellation, and few regretted its demise. Avro Canada CF-105 Arrow was a technological marvel, but its costly development and political controversy led to abrupt cancellation. Pilots admired its speed and climb rate, but the program's sudden end left crews frustrated and angry. The destruction of prototypes and blueprints meant years of work vanished overnight. The Arrow became a symbol of lost potential and wasted effort. The bitterness over its cancellation still sparks debate today. F-105 Thunder Chief, known as the Thud, was infamous in Vietnam for its high loss rate. Over 50% of deployed aircraft were lost. Pilots faced intense anti-aircraft fire, unreliable systems, and dangerous low-level bombing runs. The aircraft's heavy weight and poor maneuverability made it vulnerable in combat. Survivors remembered the Thud as a punishing, unforgiving jet that demanded everything from its pilots. Flying the F-105 was a test of nerve and luck. Heinkel He-177 Greif entered Luftwaffe service in 1942 as Germany's only long-range heavy bomber. But its twin-coupled engines were a constant source of terror for crews. The design's forced pairing of engines to drive a single propeller led to chronic overheating and frequent in-flight fires. Bombing missions over the Eastern Front became ordeals of smoke-filled cockpits and emergency landings. Many crews nicknamed it the Flaming Coffin, and the HE-177's reputation for self-destruction haunted every sortie. Martin B-26 Marauder, rushed into combat in 1941, quickly earned the nickname Widowmaker among American crews. Its high landing speed and short wingspan demanded absolute precision from pilots, and early models suffered from frequent takeoff and landing accidents. Training squadrons saw alarming loss rates, forcing a redesign of the tail and wing. Only after extensive retraining and modifications did the Marauder shed its deadly reputation, but the fear lingered for those who flew the early versions. Brewster S B-2A Buccaneer was delivered to US and British forces in 1942, but crews found it dangerously underpowered and structurally weak. The aircraft's poor handling and sluggish climb made it nearly useless in combat, and maintenance teams struggled with constant mechanical failures. The Royal Air Force refused to use it operationally, and the US Navy relegated it to training. The SB-2A became a symbol of wasted effort and was widely despised by all who encountered it. Short Stirling, Britain's first four-engine heavy bomber, entered service in 1941 with high hopes, but quickly disappointed its crews. The Stirling's short wingspan, dictated by hangar size restrictions, limited its altitude and made it vulnerable to flak and night fighters. Bomb loads were restricted, and the aircraft's tendency to ground loop on landing added to the danger. Many aircrews considered it a stopgap, and it was soon replaced by more capable bombers. Avro Manchester, introduced in 1940, was plagued by its unreliable Rolls-Royce Vulture engines. Engine failures were frequent, and the Manchester's limited range and payload made it unpopular with crews. The aircraft's poor performance led to high loss rates on early missions. The Manchester was quickly withdrawn and redesigned as the Avro Lancaster. but its brief service left a legacy of frustration and fear among RAF bomber crews. Handley Page Halifax Mark I and II, entering service in 1940, suffered from underpowered engines and poor high-altitude performance. Early Halifaxes struggled to keep up with the rest of Bomber Command, and crews faced long, dangerous missions with limited defensive firepower. The aircraft's vulnerability to night fighters and flak led to heavy losses. Later versions redeemed the Halifax name, but early crews paid in blood for a design rushed into service. Blackburn Botha, intended as a reconnaissance bomber and torpedo aircraft, was introduced in 1940, but quickly became infamous for its poor visibility and handling. Pilots struggled with the aircraft's heavy controls and tendency to stall at low speeds. The Botha's accident rate was so high that it was withdrawn from frontline service within a year. Crews dreaded being assigned to the Botha, which was soon relegated to training duties. Fairy Battle, a single-engine light bomber, entered RAF service in 1937 and quickly became obsolete with modern warfare. Its slow speed and lack of defensive armament made it easy prey for enemy fighters. During the Battle of France in May 1940, battle crews suffered catastrophic losses, exceeding 40% in some operations, with entire squadrons wiped out in days. The aircraft's vulnerability and high casualty rate made it one of the most hated and feared bombers of the early war. Armstrong Whitworth Whitley, introduced in 1937, was obsolete before World War II truly began. Its slow speed, low ceiling, and awkward nose-down flying attitude earned it the nickname Flying Barn Door among crews who flew long, cold night sorties over Germany. The Whitley's outdated design offered little protection against flak and night fighters, resulting in heavy losses. Crews endured the discomfort and danger until more modern bombers finally arrived to replace it. Petlyakov. PE-8, the Soviet Union's only four-engine heavy bomber of World War II, entered service in 1940. Crews faced unreliable engines, poor heating, and frequent mechanical breakdowns on long-range missions. With only 79 ever built, the PE-8's limited production and high accident rate meant few crews flew it in combat. Those who did returned with harrowing stories of engine fires and forced landings in the unforgiving Arctic, cementing its fearsome reputation. Convair B-36 Peacemaker, entering service in 1949, was the largest bomber ever built, with 6-piston and 4 jet engines. Crews endured 40-hour missions, forced to crawl through a narrow, frigid, unpressurized tunnel connecting the pressurized forward and aft crew compartments. The aircraft's complex systems were constantly failing. Its massive wings flexed alarmingly in turbulence, and its engines were notorious for in-flight fires. Maintenance was a nightmare, and many airmen considered it a necessary evil of early Cold War deterrence. Boeing B-47 Stratojet, introduced in 1951, brought swept-wing jet speed to Strategic Air Command. But its thin wings and bicycle landing gear made takeoffs and landings treacherous. The B-47's engines were prone to flameouts, and the aircraft's high accident rate led to hundreds of losses. Crews faced long, high-altitude missions with little margin for error. The Stratojet's reputation for danger was matched only by its strategic importance. Tupolev Tu-4, a reverse-engineered B-29, entered Soviet service in 1949. Crews struggled with unreliable engines, poor heating, and primitive navigation systems. The Tu-4's copied design was not well suited to Soviet manufacturing standards, leading to frequent breakdowns. Long-range missions over Siberia were grueling, and the aircraft's limited defensive armament left it vulnerable. The Tu-4 was a stopgap, and few crews mourned its retirement. Tupolev Tu-16, entering service in 1954, was a mainstay of Soviet bomber forces, but early models suffered from unreliable engines and poor crew comfort. The aircraft's high landing speed and limited visibility made it difficult to operate from rough airfields. Crews faced long missions over the Arctic with minimal amenities and frequent technical issues. Only later upgrades improved the Tu-16's reputation, but early crews never forgot the hardships. Vickers Valiant, the first of Britain's V-bombers, entered service in 1955. Its simple design and high-altitude role masked serious structural flaws. Fatigue cracks developed in the wing spars, leading to catastrophic failures. The entire fleet was grounded in 1965 after a fatal accident. Crews who flew the Valiant respected its reliability, but never trusted its long-term durability, and the sudden end of the program left many uneasy. Martin B-57B Canberra, an American-built version of the British Canberra, entered service in 1953. The B-57B's early ejection seats were unreliable, and the aircraft's tendency to enter flat spins at high altitude unnerved pilots. Maintenance crews struggled with engine fires and hydraulic leaks. The B-57B's accident rate was high, and its reputation for unpredictability made it one of the least liked bombers in the US inventory. Tupolev Tu-22. Blinder, introduced in 1962, was the Soviet Union's first supersonic bomber. Its sleek design masked severe handling problems and dangerous takeoff characteristics. The Tu-22's engines were prone to flameouts, and the aircraft's accident rate approaching 50% led to frequent losses and the grim nickname Man-Eater. Crews despised the cramped cockpit and poor visibility, and the blinder's operational record was marred by technical failures and pilot fatalities. Tupolev Tu-22M. Entering service in the early 1970s was a major improvement over the Tu-22, but early variants still suffered from unreliable engines and complex systems. The swing-wing design added weight and maintenance headaches. Crews faced long-range missions over hostile territory with little chance of rescue if something went wrong. Only after extensive upgrades did the Tu-22M become a reliable platform, but early crews paid the price. Convair B-58 Hustler, the world's first supersonic bomber, entered service in 1960. Its delta wing and 4 turbojets enabled Mach 2 speeds, but the aircraft was unforgiving. The B-58's high landing speed, complex systems, and minimal margin for error led to a high accident rate. Crews faced intense psychological pressure, knowing that a single mistake could be fatal. The Hustler's operational life was short, and many airmen were relieved to see it retired. Myasishchev M4. Bison, introduced in 1956, was the Soviet Union's first intercontinental jet bomber. The M4's engines were underpowered, and its range fell far short of expectations. Crews endured long, cold missions with unreliable systems and frequent fuel shortages. The Bison's operational limitations led to its rapid relegation to secondary roles, and it was never popular with those who flew it. Ilyushin 1L-28, entering service in 1950, was a simple, rugged jet bomber, but suffered from poor crew protection and limited range. The IL-28's engines were prone to flameouts, and its defensive armament was inadequate against modern fighters. The aircraft's primitive ejection system led to numerous training fatalities. Crews faced high risks on low-level attack missions, and export versions to Soviet client states fared even worse, cementing the Beagle's dangerous reputation. Tupolev Tu-95, introduced in 1956, became the backbone of Soviet strategic aviation and remains in service today. But early variants were plagued by vibration and engine fires. The Tu-95's massive contra-rotating propellers created deafening noise levels exceeding 140 decibels, causing permanent hearing damage and extreme fatigue for crews on 20-hour patrols. Despite its impressive range and payload, the Bear's early service was marked by technical problems and a punishing operational environment. Rockwell B-1B Lancer, entering service in the mid-1980s, was plagued by early technical issues and reliability problems. The variable geometry wings and complex avionics required constant attention, and crews faced frequent mission aborts. The B-1B's low-level penetration role exposed it to intense turbulence and high pilot workload. Only after years of upgrades did the Lancer become a trusted platform, but early crews endured endless frustration. Tupolev Tu-160, the world's largest supersonic bomber, entered Soviet service in the late 1980s. Early models suffered from unreliable engines, avionics failures, and high maintenance demands. The Tu-160's immense size and complexity made it difficult to operate, and crews faced long missions with little margin for error. Over time, improvements addressed many issues, but the White Swan was never an easy aircraft to master. Xi'an H-6, a Chinese license-built version of the Tu-16, entered service in 1969. Early H-6s were underpowered, with limited range and outdated avionics. Crews struggled with poor cockpit ergonomics and frequent technical failures. The H-6's slow speed and vulnerability to modern air defenses made it a risky platform in combat. Despite numerous upgrades over 5 decades, the H-6 remains in Chinese service today, continuing to accumulate peacetime losses and maintenance incidents that prove the old fears were justified. On July 29, 1967, a wiring fault in the weapons pylons of USS Forrestal fired a Zuni rocket across the flight deck, igniting a fire that killed 134 men. The fault had been reported before flight operations began that morning. It had not been corrected. Investigation found safety procedures had been compressed to meet sortie rate demands, leaving deck crews without time for standard checks. 134 men died on a maintenance schedule that someone had decided could wait. HMS Dasher exploded and sank in the Firth of Clyde on March 27, 1943, in under a minute, killing 379 of her crew. The cause was aviation fuel vapor igniting in the ship's inadequately ventilated hangar, a design defect the Royal Navy had been requesting American shipbuilders to correct for months. The Admiralty suppressed the inquiry findings for nearly 40 years, citing wartime morale. Families of the dead were told their men had died on active service. The wreck location was classified until 1982. Taiho was Japan's most advanced carrier. Armored flight deck, damage control built to survive what had killed her predecessors. Her crew had reported that aviation fuel vented inadequately below decks. Those reports were unresolved when she deployed. On June 19, 1944, a torpedo punctured a fuel tank. A damage control officer ordered maximum ventilation to clear the fumes. The vapor reached every compartment instead. 6 hours later, a spark finished her. Japan's most protected carrier was destroyed by a defect her own crew had flagged and nobody had fixed. She sank 2 Allied ships in peacetime without an enemy within range. HMAS Melbourne collided with HMAS Voyager during exercises in 1964, killing 82 men, then collided with USS Frank E. Evans during exercises in 1969, killing 74 more. Both inquiries attributed fault to procedural failures rather than the ship herself. Sailors assigned in the years that followed checked transfer request procedures before reporting aboard. She served another 13 years after the second collision. Her crew's opinion of the inquiry findings was not included in the inquiry findings. A catapult hydraulic line exploded aboard USS Bennington on May 26, 1954, killing 103 men in the worst peacetime carrier disaster in American history. The crew had flagged the relevant maintenance issue to supervisors in the months before it happened. The Navy's subsequent inquiry attributed responsibility to procedural failures by the dead. The surviving crew knew what they had reported and when. The inquiry results were consistent with the institutional outcome the Navy preferred. The maintenance reports they had submitted were not cited in the findings. Converted from a Yamato-class hull into a carrier, Shinano was crewed by men given 11 days to prepare a vessel that required months of workup. When USS Archerfish torpedoed her in November 1944, damage control parties could not contain flooding through compartments that had never been properly tested because the ship had never been properly completed. She sank in 17 hours. Japan's most powerful carrier went to the bottom because someone decided the delivery schedule mattered more than the readiness of the crew assigned to meet it. Her crew called her the covered wagon and meant it as a complaint. USS Langley was the lowest status carrier assignment in the late 1920s, the posting you accepted when you had no leverage to refuse. The men who suffered through it developed, without realizing it, every doctrine that would govern how American carriers fought in the Pacific. They built the future of naval aviation on a ship they despised. The fleet they created could not have existed without them. Designed as a compromise between treaty limits and operational reality, USS Ranger felt like one in every sea state above moderate. She sat so low that her flight deck was regularly awash, her berthing flooded in heavy weather, and she rolled in conditions other carriers handled without difficulty. She was the only pre-war American fleet carrier never to serve in the Pacific. Pacific commanders refused to risk her. Her crew understood exactly what that refusal communicated about how the Navy assessed the lives of the people assigned to her. Her pilots had a name for launching from IJN Junyo's abbreviated flight deck: the moment of truth. And they did not mean it encouragingly. Converted from a passenger liner, Junyo broke down repeatedly in combat throughout 1942 and 1943. Her engineers repaired her under fire, while her commanding officers reported her operational. At Guadalcanal, mechanical failure reduced her capacity at the precise moment the battle needed everything she had. The repair reports and the operational status reports contradicted each other. Only one reached the fleet commanders. The world's first purpose-built carrier, HMS Hermes, was 18 years old in 1942. Slow, unreliable, operating without adequate escort in the Indian Ocean. Her crew's assessment of her combat capability and the Admiralty's official position had been diverging for years. On April 9, 1942, Japanese aircraft found her off Ceylon and sank her in approximately 10 minutes. Her crew had understood for some time that she was outclassed. The Admiralty's position had not made the aircraft slower. USS Saratoga housed her crew in compartments designed for a battlecruiser and never properly redesigned for carrier aviation. Men slept in spaces built as ammunition handling rooms. She was also torpedoed 4 times across her service life, twice in 1942 alone, leading her crew to nickname her the Saramaru, a dark reference to Japanese torpedo accuracy that was considerably funnier to sailors not assigned to her. She absorbed more torpedo hits than any other American carrier that survived the war. Germany's only aircraft carrier was laid down in 1936, launched in 1938, and never completed. Not because she could not be finished, but because Hermann Goering and the Kriegsmarine spent 6 years arguing over who would control her aircraft. The crew assigned during fitting-out phases watched steel sit idle through jurisdictional disputes the decision-makers considered more urgent than the ship. She was scuttled in 1945, still incomplete. The men who worked on her had known, long before the end, that the argument mattered more than the carrier. A fleet carrier sent to hunt submarines without adequate escort in September 1939, HMS Courageous was operating in waters where U-boats were known to be active. 15 days into the war, U-29 torpedoed and sank her with 519 men. The Royal Navy immediately stopped using fleet carriers on anti-submarine patrol. It had needed a fleet carrier and 519 dead to confirm that this was a mistake. The lesson was not complicated. It was expensive. Returning from the Norway evacuation on June 8, 1940, with near-empty tanks and no aircraft airborne, HMS Glorious was intercepted by Scharnhorst and Gneisenau and sunk in 90 minutes with more than 1,200 men. The inquiry found her captain had requested an independent return without adequate escort for reasons never satisfactorily explained, and that no distress signal reached British forces in time. 43 men survived. The inquiry findings were quietly managed for decades and not fully released until 2001. The 61-year delay did not change what had happened. On March 19, 1945, USS Franklin was operating closer to the Japanese mainland than any other American carrier during the war, when 2 bombs ignited armed aircraft on her deck and killed more than 800 of her crew, the highest single-day casualties of any US warship that survived. She had been positioned at extreme range to maximize strike distance. The surviving crew spent the following decades expressing their assessment of that decision in memoirs and testimonies with a clarity that official Navy accounts of the battle do not fully reproduce. Forward deployed to Yokosuka since 1973, USS Midway maintained continuous Pacific availability at a cost measured in retention figures the Navy tracked carefully and addressed inadequately. 3-year forward deployments with compressed maintenance windows and family separation timelines beyond any other surface Navy assignment produced mid-1980s crew satisfaction scores that documented precisely what was happening. The strategic logic was defensible. A carrier in Japan responds faster than one in San Diego. The men living that logic on 3-year cycles had documented opinions. The surveys are in the record. When the Royal Navy decided it could not afford both HMS Eagle and HMS Ark Royal, it chose Ark Royal and began removing Eagle's engines, radars, and aircraft systems to keep her sister operational. Eagle's crew watched their ship being stripped around them. She was decommissioned in 1972, hollowed out by a parts program that had prioritized the headline carrier over the one whose crew was actually making her work. She was cannibalized for a ship decommissioned 7 years later. Her crew had kept her flying. The budget decided which one mattered. USS United States was cancelled 5 days after her keel was laid. The Navy's senior aviators resigned in protest in the revolt of the admirals. The carrier they had been promised was replaced by a doctrine assuming the Air Force could do what the Navy argued required carriers. 3 years later, carrier aviation over Korea demonstrated what the cancelled ship would have provided. The admirals who resigned had been correct. The keel had already been cut up for scrap. Assignment to USS Coral Sea in the 1970s came with an informal explanation of why the oldest carrier in the active fleet had been scheduled for decommissioning 4 times and was still underway. The budget to replace her had never been allocated. Her crew maintained her beyond design service life. She launched strikes against Libya in 1986 from a flight deck built in 1947. The men who flew those missions did so from a hull that should have been retired before most of them enlisted. On December 19, 1960, while under construction at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, USS Constellation caught fire when a torch was used near a fuel tank that had not been properly cleared, killing 50 workers and delaying her commissioning by more than a year. The construction site had been operating under accelerated schedule pressure. The Navy investigated, paid the families, and commissioned the ship. The 50 men who died building her occupy approximately 1 paragraph in her official history. She served for 40 years. that paragraph has not grown. USS Enterprise, commissioned in 1961 with the most advanced nuclear propulsion afloat, and living conditions her crew described as among the least adequate in the surface navy. The budget had fully funded the reactors and treated habitability as a rounding error. Berthing was below current standards, ventilation was inadequate for tropical deployment, and recreational facilities were insufficient for 4,000 men at sea. The most capable carrier in the world. The people operating that capability lived like the budget had run out before it reached them. HMS Ark Royal survived the 1966 Defence Review that recommended eliminating the Royal Navy's carrier fleet, but the maintenance budget that should have kept her operational did not fully survive alongside her. Through the 1970s, she was kept flying by crew improvisation that compensated for a spares allocation bearing diminishing relationship to her actual material needs. The official position was that she remained combat-ready. Her engineers, who knew what had been cannibalized from which systems to keep others running, held a more detailed understanding of what combat-ready meant aboard her. The smallest fleet carrier Japan operated at Midway, IJN Hiryu, was the only one undamaged when American dive bombers destroyed Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu on the morning of June 4, 1942. Her crew spent the rest of that day fighting alone, striking Yorktown twice, keeping the battle alive after Japan's carrier force had effectively ceased to exist. She was found and fatally hit that evening. Her crew fought a battle that was already lost and came within one aircraft of changing its outcome. One carrier, one day. Almost enough. Japan's most celebrated carrier, flagship of the Pearl Harbor raid, was built on a battlecruiser hull whose hangar deck venting problems had been flagged during the 1927 conversion and accepted rather than resolved. At Midway, a near miss ignited fires that spread through compartments carrying years of unresolved hazards. Her damage control teams could not contain them. Japan's most famous carrier was destroyed by design compromises that had been documented, reported, and left unaddressed for 15 years. The engineers who had flagged the problems were correct. Nobody had acted on what they wrote. Built to a treaty limit that forced a choice between armor and aircraft capacity, USS Wasp was given aircraft capacity and almost nothing else. Her torpedo protection was nominal. Assigned to the Pacific in 1942, she was torpedoed by I-19 on September 15th and sunk after fires reached her magazines. She lasted 43 days in the theater. Her crew had known what she lacked for the entirety of their time aboard. The Navy had known too. The Pacific confirmed it in 6 weeks. The maintenance reports USS Essex's crew submitted in her final years as an anti-submarine carrier documented conditions her command chain continued to describe as operational. Personnel shortages extended rotations to cover unfilled billets. Systems were repaired to minimums and returned to service rather than properly overhauled. The Navy's position was that she was meeting her operational commitments. This was accurate. The men meeting those commitments on a hull that should have been in the yards were doing so with a precision the official record does not convey. The crew that commissioning served USS Gerald R. Ford in 2017 inherited weapons elevators that did not move weapons and electromagnetic catapults that failed at rates making sustained flight operations a daily negotiation. The elevators were eventually certified. The catapults were eventually fixed. Her 2022 Mediterranean deployment was described by Navy leadership as one of the most successful in recent memory. The crew that had lived through the broken years had their own word for what they had accomplished. The Navy called it a success. They called it survival. Her armoured flight deck was the Royal Navy's answer to carriers dying when aircraft found them. On January 10, 1941, a massed Stuka attack left HMS Illustrious on fire and listing, and she survived damage that would have destroyed any American carrier of the period. Her crew spent 4 months in Malta and the United States in repairs. The men who kept her afloat were not consulted when architects elsewhere concluded that armored flight decks reduced aircraft capacity by an unacceptable margin. The capacity argument was correct. Illustrious was still afloat. USS Nimitz, commissioned in 1975 as the most powerful warship ever built, and provided living spaces that retention surveys described as among the most cramped in the carrier fleet. The nuclear budget had ended at the reactor. Berthing for 5,000 men had been a secondary design concern. Sailors filed the paperwork and showed up. The ship that defined American naval power for 50 years was, in her first decade, one of the least wanted postings in carrier aviation. They served anyway. The next carrier class was named after her. Inside USS Monitor. On a summer afternoon in 1862, the temperature at the gun turret regularly exceeded 140 degrees Fahrenheit. The crew called it the Iron Coffin, and the name was precise. The ironclad that defeated CSS Virginia at Hampton Roads was a death trap. The ventilation pulled smoke into the hull, the turret jammed under combat conditions, and the low freeboard flooded the vessel through its own ventilation pipes. She sank in a storm off Cape Hatteras on December 31, 1862. The ship that changed naval warfare was the ship nobody wanted to be inside. The double-turreted ironclad was supposed to be an improvement on the Monitor concept. More firepower, greater stability, better crew conditions. USS Onondaga delivered on the firepower. Everything else was worse. Summer temperatures inside the armored hull made the berthing spaces physically uninhabitable. Winter temperatures made them nearly as dangerous. The turrets, designed to rotate for all-around fire, regularly seized in cold weather and required the crew to climb outside under potential fire to clear them manually. Onondaga served the entire remaining period of the Civil War on the James River without ever sinking an enemy vessel. Her crew called her a floating prison. The prison floated. The war ended. Nobody built another one like her. The United States Navy commissioned USS Vesuvius in 1890 with a weapon system that could not be aimed. 3 15-inch pneumatic dynamite guns were fixed permanently into the bow at an angle of approximately 8 to 12 degrees, meaning the ship herself had to be pointed directly at the target for the weapons to fire, and range was adjusted exclusively by varying the air pressure in the firing mechanism. In practice, hitting anything required precise navigation, calm water, and considerable optimism. Vesuvius fired her guns in anger once, during the bombardment of Santiago in 1898, with results described in official reports as negligible. Her crew had known this for years. The Navy took 8 more years to retire her. Perpetually wet, perpetually crowded, and perpetually unreliable. This was the Omaha class as her crews experienced her. USS Omaha and her sisters were designed in the final years of the First World War and built in the early 1920s. And every design decision that made sense in 1917 was a liability by 1941. The low freeboard soaked the forward gun crews in any sea state above moderate. The torpedo tubes occupied space that left the crew quarters at a density that made long deployments genuinely miserable. The machinery was chronically unreliable. Omaha-class ships spent more time in repair yards than almost any other interwar class. They were nicknamed the Misery class. The name required no explanation. The men who served on landing ship tanks called them large, slow targets, and the name was not affectionate. Flat-bottomed, boxy, built with the sea-keeping qualities of a bathtub, the LST rolled in conditions that would barely inconvenience a destroyer, pitched in conditions that made cooking impossible, and combined both motions in heavy weather into something that incapacitated significant portions of every crew. They were not fast enough to evade aircraft, They were not armored enough to survive sustained fire. They were not stable enough to be comfortable in any weather. They were absolutely essential. The only vessel that could deliver tanks directly onto a beach. The crews who sailed them never stopped complaining. Both things were entirely correct. Landing craft infantry were built on the assumption that the men inside them would spend as little time aboard as possible, a few hours at most before hitting the beach. The designers were correct about the intention and wrong about the reality. LC is spent weeks at sea between operations in conditions they were never designed to handle. The flat hull pounded in any sea state. The engine spaces were unbearably hot. The troop berthing was designed for short occupancy and provided for nothing else. Crews of typically 2 officers and 22 enlisted men lived in these conditions for months, delivering men to beaches and returning for the next load. The LCI was in service for all of it. No ship in American naval history accumulated misfortune more consistently than USS Chesapeake. She was undermanned at launch, understaffed with trained gunners throughout her service, and twice involved in incidents that ended careers and started wars. In 1807, she was stopped by HMS Leopard and searched for deserters, an act of humiliation that hardened American opinion toward Britain for 5 years. In 1813, she was taken by HMS Shannon in 11 minutes of combat, with 47 Americans dead and her captain dying with the words, "Don't give up the ship." Every crew that served in her knew the history. The ship that became a battle cry was more useful as a slogan than she ever was as a warship. Before USS Constellation ever put to sea, she had killed 50 workers and injured more than 300 in a fire during construction in December 1960 that burned for 3 days at Brooklyn Navy Yard. Constellation entered service in 1961, carrying her construction disaster's memory and the reputation she confirmed with a second fire in 1965. And mechanical failures so consistent, her crew nicknamed her Connie the Constipated. 20 years of deployments, 2 fire disasters, and a machinery record that filled more maintenance logs than almost any carrier in the fleet. She served until 2003. The fire in Brooklyn was never entirely forgotten by the men who sailed her. The crew of USS Cyclops feared their commander more than the ocean. Lieutenant Commander George W. Worley was, by documented accounts, erratic and abusive, given to appearing on deck in his underwear, threatening crew members, and making navigational decisions other officers refused to countersign. Cyclops departed Barbados in March 1918 with 309 aboard, overloaded with manganese ore, 1 engine inoperative, her captain refusing any course deviation despite weather warnings. She was never seen again. No wreckage was ever found. No distress signal was ever received. No cause was ever established. What it could establish was that the crew had been complaining about Worley for years before he sailed them into nothing. On the night of the 26th of October 1972, fighting broke out on the mess decks of USS Kitty Hawk and spread through the ship for the next 3 hours. More than 100 men had been injured, 6 seriously enough to require hospitalization. It was racial violence between members of the same crew in the middle of the Tonkin Gulf on an operational aircraft carrier. The conditions that produced it had been building for months. Inadequate berthing for black sailors, discriminatory assignment practices, a command structure that had failed to address documented grievances through any official channel. The congressional investigation called it a breakdown of military order. What it was a ship that had become the battlefield. USS Liberty was unarmed, clearly marked, flying the American flag off the Sinai Peninsula on the 8th of June 1967, when Israeli aircraft and torpedo boats attacked her for 75 minutes. 34 Americans were killed. 171 were wounded. Liberty's crew fought the fires, kept her afloat, and transmitted distress signals that were initially recalled by American command before help arrived. The subsequent American government response was to classify the incident, accept Israeli claims of mistaken identity, and impose restrictions on the survivors that prevented them from speaking publicly about what had happened. The official accounting never came. If you want to explore this further, links to recommended books and scale models are in the description below. The crew of USS Juno knew before she was launched that her design had a problem. The light cruiser's ammunition magazine sat directly adjacent to her keel. A torpedo strike in the right location would detonate everything simultaneously. Naval architects knew this. The crew knew this. On the 13th of November 1942, during the naval battle of Guadalcanal, a Japanese torpedo found exactly that location. The explosion was so complete that Juno effectively ceased to exist in the space of 20 seconds. Of 710 men aboard, 687 died, including all 5 Sullivan brothers. The ship that the crew had been afraid of proved exactly as lethal as they feared. USS Indianapolis delivered components of the first atomic bomb to Tinian Island on the 26th of July 1945 and was torpedoed 4 days later. 300 went down with the ship. 880 entered the water. When rescue finally arrived 4 days later, only 316 were still alive. The rest taken by sharks, exposure, dehydration, and drowning, while the Navy failed to notice that one of its cruisers had not arrived at its destination. The ship did not fail her crew. The Navy's failure to notice she was missing and to respond when she was reported overdue was what killed them. The men who died deserved a faster search. On the 15th of October 1942, USS Meredith was sunk by Japanese aircraft while carrying aviation fuel and supplies to Guadalcanal, a mission her crew considered a death sentence before it began. The ship had no air cover. Japanese aircraft had been spotted in the area. The mission proceeded anyway because the Marines on Guadalcanal needed the fuel and the Navy had no better option. Japanese dive bombers and torpedo planes found Meredith at 11 in the morning. She sank within the hour. Of 259 men, only 78 survived after 2 days in shark-infested waters. The fuel never reached Guadalcanal. The mission accomplished nothing. On the 29th of July 1967, a rocket accidentally discharged on the flight deck of USS Forrestal, igniting a fire that killed 134 men and injured 161 more in a sequence of explosions that lasted for 13 hours. What turned the accident into a catastrophe was ordnance that did not meet safety specifications, firefighting systems inadequate for jet fuel fires, and procedures that had not anticipated simultaneous multiple explosions. Forrestal was repaired and returned to service. The crew who survived her called her the fire trap. The Navy made significant changes to carrier safety procedures. The changes came one carrier fire too late. The first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier in history carried a crew of more than 5,000 men in conditions designed for 3,000. USS Enterprise entered service in 1961 as the largest warship ever built and demonstrated immediately that size and habitability were not the same thing. Her 8 reactors created heat loads that made certain compartments nearly uninhabitable in tropical climates. Her complexity, 4 times the mechanical systems of a conventional carrier, meant something was always broken. On the 18th of January 1969, a fire and explosions on her flight deck off Hawaii killed 27 and wounded 314. She was nicknamed the Big E. The nickname was affectionate. The conditions were not. On the 15th of May, 1969, USS Guitarro sank at her berth at the Mare Island Naval Shipyard in California while under construction. Not from enemy action, not from mechanical failure, not from any natural cause, but because two separate civilian work crews simultaneously pumped water into different sections of the hull without coordinating with each other. The salvage operation cost approximately $22 million. The congressional investigation revealed that Mare Island had inadequate oversight procedures, inadequate crew assignment during fitting out, and inadequate communication between work parties. Guittaro was raised, repaired, and commissioned. She served 20 years. The Navy never fully explained how a submarine sank while still in the shipyard. 84 days underwater. No port calls, no communication with family, no sunlight. USS Triton completed the first submerged circumnavigation of the globe between February and May 1960. A mission conceived as a demonstration of nuclear capability and experienced by her crew as a psychological endurance test with no equivalent in naval service. The crew could tell nobody what they had done. When Triton surfaced, her commander received a ticker-tape parade and a presidential commendation. The enlisted men returned to their families on standard sea duty pay, unable to explain where they had been. The achievement was real. The recognition was selective. The men who made it possible were not invited to the parade. Before USS Scorpion was lost, her crew had submitted multiple maintenance reports documenting unresolved equipment failures. The nuclear attack submarine was overdue for an overhaul, repeatedly deferred. She departed in May 1968, with known mechanical issues unresolved. She was never heard from again. The Navy located her wreckage in October 1968, broken in two sections at a depth of 11,000 feet in the Atlantic. 99 men were lost. The official cause was never conclusively established. What the records established was that the crew had been reporting problems the Navy had not prioritized. The ship disappeared precisely as they had feared. USS Pueblo was sent to collect intelligence off the coast of North Korea in January 1968, with one crew member trained in the destruction of classified materials, no working defensive armament, and no plan for what should happen if North Korean vessels approached. On the 23rd of January, North Korean ships surrounded Pueblo and opened fire. Commander Lloyd Bucher attempted to destroy classified documents while trying to escape, failed at both, and surrendered. The first American warship captured in peacetime since 1807. The crew spent 335 days in North Korean captivity, subjected to systematic abuse. A Navy inquiry recommended court-martialing Bucher. The secretary overruled it, citing the conditions under which Pueblo had been sent. The littoral combat ship was supposed to solve every problem the Navy had with small surface combatants. Fast, modular, capable of swapping mission packages to become whatever the fleet needed. USS Freedom entered service in 2008 and demonstrated immediately that the modularity did not work. The speed came at the cost of range and endurance, and the reduced crew could not repair the ship at sea when things broke. Things broke frequently. Freedom suffered a catastrophic propulsion failure in 2016. Her class was decommissioned beginning in 2021, years ahead of schedule. The Navy spent $4 billion on a ship it could not maintain, adequately crew, or rely on in combat. The concept was revolutionary. The execution was not. When USS San Antonio was delivered to the United States Navy in 2006, she came with 2,511 documented deficiencies, not suggestions, not minor punch list items, documented deficiencies, structural problems, system failures, and equipment that did not function as specified. The sewage system failed repeatedly in the first months of operation, requiring the crew to manage waste manually in conditions they described in official complaints as unacceptable. The ship had cost $1.25 billion. San Antonio eventually became operational and served creditably. The crew that took delivery of her in 2006 had not volunteered to commission a ship that required a separate contract just to make it work. USS Zumwalt's first deployment ended in the Panama Canal when her propulsion system failed. Her second deployment produced additional engineering casualties. In her first years, the most advanced destroyer the Navy had ever built spent a significant portion of its time in various stages of mechanical failure, with a crew that had been trained on systems that did not yet have complete technical manuals and asked to maintain equipment for which no established maintenance procedures existed. The Navy cancelled the class at 3 hulls. The advanced gun system was removed from all 3 ships when ammunition cost approximately $800,000 per round. The crew served a ship the Navy had not finished designing. On the 11th of May, 1945, USS Bunker Hill was struck by 2 kamikaze aircraft within 30 seconds off Okinawa. 393 men were killed, 264 wounded. The ship did not sink. Her crew, many of them burning, fought fires for hours while the ship remained operational. The hatred Bunker Hill's crew carried was not hatred of their ship. It was hatred of everything that placed them there. The war, the mission tempo, the command decisions. The ship absorbed all of it. The ship did not fail them. That is the difference between a ship that broke its crew and one that held them together when everything else tried to break them both. Some tanks killed the enemy. Some tanks killed the men inside them first. The Mark I arrived at the Somme in September 1916 and immediately demonstrated everything wrong with it. The crew of 8 worked in a steel box filled with engine fumes, cordite smoke, and temperatures that regularly reached 50 degrees Celsius. The transmission required 2 men to operate simultaneously, with no communication possible over the engine noise. Visibility was 4 narrow slits in cast iron. When the tank bellied on a trench, the crew had one option: exit under fire and push. The Renault FT gave France a light tank that could actually maneuver in 1918, but put 2 men in a turret designed for 1. Commander and gunner were the same man. He aimed, loaded, fired, observed, and directed the driver by kicking him in the shoulders. Left shoulder for left turn, right for right, both for stop. The driver could not hear anything else. In extended combat, the commander lost track of the battle entirely, buried in a rhythm of load, aim, fire that left no capacity for situational awareness. The Fiat 3000 was Italy's first domestic tank, produced in 1921, and it solved no problem the FT had and introduced several new ones. The engine was underpowered for its weight, the tracks shed under sustained load, and the 2-man crew operated in temperatures that made the FT look well ventilated. Italian tankers called it the stufa, the stove. It served into the Second World War against opponents who had spent 20 years building better tanks. The crews knew it. The Type 95 Harrowing was Japan's primary light tank through most of the Pacific War, and it was built for a 1930s threat. Against infantry and light vehicles, it performed. Against anything with a real gun, it did not. The armor was rifle-proof. The crews understood this meant it was not cannon-proof, not artillery-proof, not aircraft-proof. American tankers learned to deal with Harrowing by shooting it. Japanese tankers learned to deal with American tanks by dying in them. The light tank Mark VI was Britain's most numerous tank at the outbreak of the war, and it carried 2 machine guns into a conflict that required cannon. Crews in France 1940 watched German armor approach at ranges their weapons could not touch. The Mark VI's commander stood exposed in an open turret to see anything. Closing the hatch reduced visibility to almost nothing. Surviving British tankers described the choice as between blindness and exposure. The T-26 was a licensed Vickers design that the Red Army built in the thousands and deployed with catastrophic results in 1941. Thin armor, riveted construction, and a gasoline engine made each tank a fire waiting for ignition. When a round penetrated, and nearly anything penetrated, the rivets became projectiles. Soviet tankers had a phrase for what happened to crews in T-26s hit by German anti-tank fire. The phrase was not printable. The tank was not survivable. The Panzer II was never meant to fight. It was a training and transition platform that Germany's armored doctrine pressed into frontline service from Poland through North Africa. The 20mm gun could not penetrate medium armor from any angle. Crews in France in 1940 found themselves engaging Matildas and Char B-1s at close range with weapons that sparked off the hulls without penetrating. German tankers filed complaints in writing. The complaints were filed. The M3 Lee arrived in North Africa in 1942, carrying a crew of 6 and a fundamental design problem. The main gun was hull-mounted, so the entire tank had to turn to engage a target. The crew worked in 2 compartments, with no direct communication between them. The commander operated a 37mm turret gun while directing the driver and coordinating with the hull gunner below, all by voice over engine noise in a tank that heated to furnace temperatures in the desert. Sergeant William McCombs, 1st Armored Division, wrote that fighting in the Lee was like operating a factory while someone shelled it. The Valentine was cramped before anyone climbed inside. British designers produced a tank with a turret ring so narrow that the 3-man crew worked in conditions that made reload a physical contest between loader and gunner for the same 18 inches of space. In sustained combat, the loader's arms gave out. Turret traverse was mechanical and slow. In the seconds it took to track a moving target, the target moved. When the ring jammed under mud or damage, which it did, the turret became a fixed gun in a tank that had lost its main tactical advantage. Crews described a particular claustrophobia that the Valentine produced. Not the ordinary closeness of armored vehicles, but the specific feeling that the machine itself was fighting them. The Type 97 Chiha was Japan's best medium tank of the war, which tells you something about Japanese medium tanks. 2 men operated the turret, commander and gunner, but the commander had no hatch above his position, only a fixed cupola with limited periscopes. Awareness of anything beyond a narrow forward arc required opening the turret and exposing himself to fire. Chiha crews in the Philippines described the choice as tactical blindness versus personal death. The M13/40 was Italy's answer to a question no one had asked. How to build a medium tank that combined the worst features of a light tank with the worst features of a heavy one. The diesel engine was reliable, but the carburetor flooded under stress, stopping the tank at the worst possible moments. The commander also loaded and fired. The gun sight was inadequate. In North Africa, British forces captured M1340s in running condition because the crews had abandoned them, not destroyed them, abandoned them, and walked into captivity rather than fight in vehicles they no longer believed in. No other tank in this video produced that result consistently. The KV-1 was the tank the Germans couldn't kill in 1941, and the tank the Soviet crews could barely operate. The gearbox required a hammer to shift under combat conditions. The transmission frequently locked in motion. The radio, when present, which was not always, worked intermittently. Crews in the initial weeks of Barbarossa reported KV-1s driving until they broke down mechanically, then being abandoned because the crew couldn't fix them and couldn't call for help. The tank that stopped German panzers cold in some engagements was stranded by its own engineers in others. The Panther appeared in 1943 with everything German armor had been demanding. Thick, sloped armor, a long, high-velocity gun, wide tracks for the Eastern Front mud. It also appeared with a final drive that failed at a rate no production tank could sustain. At Kursk, More Panthers were lost to mechanical breakdown than to Soviet action on the first day. The cooling system overheated under load. Fuel leaked onto hot exhaust. Crews learned to identify the smell of burning transmission fluid as the sound of their tank dying under them, which it did, repeatedly in the middle of engagements where stopping meant death. If you want to explore how tank design shaped real battles, we've put recommended books and scale models in the description below. The Crusaders' mechanical unreliability in North Africa became so notorious that British crews performed pre-combat rituals around it, checking the cooling system last because that was always the final failure. The Liberty engine ran hot in the desert, and hotter still in sustained action. Drivetrain failures mid-engagement left crews stranded in the open. Crusader squadrons entered some engagements knowing statistically that a percentage of their tanks would stop on their own before the Germans fired a shot. The commanders factored this into their planning. The crews lived with it. The Covenanter never left Britain. It was too unreliable to ship. The cooling system design placed the radiators at the front of the tank in a configuration that overheated the engine under anything beyond parade ground conditions. After 2 years of attempted fixes, the War Office concluded the problem was not fixable and restricted the Covenanter to training roles. British tank crews trained in vehicles they knew were being kept away from actual combat because they couldn't survive it. This affected morale in ways the reports describe carefully and at length. The Tiger II entered service in 1944, weighing nearly 70 tons and carrying a gun that could kill anything the Allies fielded at ranges beyond 2 kilometers. It also carried a final drive, engineered for a tank 40 tons lighter. The suspension components fractured under the weight they were designed to carry. Recovery vehicles couldn't tow a broken Tiger II. They needed 2 recovery vehicles and coordination the battlefield rarely permitted. Crews in the Ardennes abandoned functioning Tiger IIs because the fuel system couldn't be resupplied fast enough for a tank that burned 30 liters per kilometer. Exceptional weapon, unsustainable machine. The Sherman came in dozens of variants, and its crews came in 2 types: those who had seen one burn and those who hadn't yet. The early gasoline engine and ammunition stowage gave it a reputation the crews carried before they climbed inside. Sergeant Joe Norris, 3rd Armored Division, wrote that when his Sherman was hit in Normandy, the fire was visible from 300 yards within seconds. He and his gunner went out the hatch. The loader didn't make it. The Army later introduced wet stowage and different ammunition placement. By then, the nickname had already been earned. Every Sherman crew knew it. The T-34/85 was a war winner and a misery to operate. The turret held 3 men in a space designed for 2. The commander was also the loader in many configurations, which destroyed the ability to command. Head down in the breach, no awareness of the battlefield. Soviet doctrine partially solved this by accepting high losses and replacing crews rather than redesigning the turret. The tank that broke the Wehrmacht's back at Kursk was also the tank that exhausted its crews in ways the operational records document carefully and the medals do not mention. The AMX-13 carried an automatic loader that fired 12 rounds without human intervention, a genuine engineering achievement in 1952. Then the drum ran empty. At that point, the loader had to open his hatch, climb partially out of the tank, and reload the magazine by hand, in the open, under whatever fire was present. French crews in Algeria and in the 1967 war described the moment the 12th round fired as a specific kind of dread. Not fear of the enemy, but fear of the clock. The pause that followed was not tactical, it was structural. The engineers had solved the loading problem. They had not solved what happened next. The STRV-103 had no turret. The commander aimed the tank by steering the hull, which meant he was driver, gunner, and commander simultaneously. 3 roles occupying the same pair of hands. In Swedish exercises during the 1970s, instructors would stop training after 6 hours and order commanders out of their vehicles, not for rest, but because the psychological compression of 3 identities in one seat produced errors that no amount of training fully corrected. Veterans described engaging targets feeling like arguing with themselves. No other tank in this video asked its crew to be the weapon. The M48A1 reached Korea and Europe carrying a gasoline engine, in a tank world that had moved to diesel, and the crews understood exactly what that meant. Gasoline ignites faster, it burns hotter, it gives almost no warning. M48A1 crews in West Germany ran pre-mission checks, knowing that a penetrating hit in the right place would produce a fire their training described, but their survival instincts rejected. The tank was scheduled for replacement from the moment it entered service. The replacement took years. The crews who filled the gap between decision and delivery did not complain publicly. Their maintenance logs say enough. The T-64 introduced composite armor, gas turbine options, and an automatic loader that removed the human loader from the equation. It also introduced a maintenance profile so complex that Soviet armored units required factory-trained technicians to keep them operational. Line mechanics couldn't fix a T-64 in the field without support that the field rarely provided. The tank that was supposed to outperform NATO armor was frequently non-operational due to problems that required 3 days and a specialized team to diagnose. Impressive weapon, difficult machine. The Leopard 1 was built on a deliberate gamble. Armor protection was sacrificed for speed and firepower, because NATO doctrine held that a fast tank that never stopped would never be hit. Early Bundeswehr crews trained in vehicles their own commanders openly acknowledged couldn't survive a hit from contemporary Soviet weapons. The doctrine said it would never come to that. The crews trained anyway, in armor they knew was a theory, not protection. Some of them wrote about it. The ones who wrote about it most were the ones who believed it least. The T-72 that reached Iraq was not the T-72 the Red Army kept for itself. The export version carried downgraded fire control, thinner composite armor, and crews who had trained on equipment that performed differently from what they were told it could do. In 1991, Iraqi T-72 crews engaged American M1A1s and discovered their guns couldn't penetrate the frontal armor at combat ranges. The M1A1s could penetrate the T-72 from any angle, at any range. The engagement records show some Iraqi crews fired multiple rounds before abandoning their tanks. They were not running from a better army. They were running from a promise that had been broken before they climbed inside. The T-80 was the Red Army's most advanced tank when it entered Grozny in December 1994. Russian commanders sent columns into the city without infantry support, without reconnaissance, without understanding that urban terrain negated every advantage the T-80 carried. Chechen fighters with rocket-propelled grenades fired down into the thin roof armor, the one surface the T-80's designers had left unprotected, because no threat from above had been incorporated into the design specification. Tanks burned in traffic jams of their own making. Crews who survived the first hit had seconds. Tanks were built to survive the battlefield. The men inside them had to survive the tank first. The H.L. Hunley was not built to survive. She was built to kill, and she did. But she killed her own crews first. Hand-cranked by 8 men in a steel tube 4 feet wide, she flooded on August 29, 1863, during a training exercise, killing 5. A second crew was recruited. On October 15th, she went down again during a practice dive, this time taking her designer Horace Hunley and 7 men with her. A third crew volunteered. On February 17, 1864, she became the first submarine in history to sink an enemy warship, putting a spar torpedo into USS Housatonic off Charleston Harbor. She never returned. Lieutenant Dixon's gold coin, bent by a bullet at Shiloh, carried as a lucky piece ever since, was found with his remains in 2001. It had not kept him lucky enough. The French Navy launched Farfadet in 1901 with considerable optimism. She was modern, fast on the surface, and assigned to the Mediterranean fleet at Bizerte. On July 6, 1905, she flooded during dive trials in the harbour. 14 men were trapped inside, while rescue teams hammered on the hull and the air turned unbreathable. 6 survived after 12 hours. The Navy raised the boat, repaired her, renamed her Folle, and returned her to service. In 1906, she flooded again, in the same harbour, under nearly identical circumstances. This time, there were no survivors. 2 boats, 1 class, 1 harbour, the same outcome twice. American submariners called them pig boats, and the name required no explanation. The S-boats were cramped, poorly ventilated, and persistently wet. Diesel fumes built up in the hull faster than the ventilation could clear them, and the crews who lived in them on long patrols returned to port in worse condition than the machinery. S5 was the worst day the class ever had. On September 1st, 1920, she flooded her engine room off the Delaware coast and sank in 194 feet of water. Commander Charles Cook and his crew spent 36 hours inside a slowly flooding hull before a passing merchant ship heard them tapping on the propeller shaft, the one section of the boat that protruded above the waterline. A machinist's mate bored through the stern plating with a hand drill from inside. They got out. Most S-class emergencies did not end that way. The K-class submarines were the product of a requirements document that should never have been written. The Royal Navy wanted submarines fast enough to operate with the battle fleet, and the only way the Royal Navy believed it could achieve the required speed was steam propulsion. This meant boilers. This meant funnels. This meant, on every dive, a race to shut down the boilers, retract the funnels, seal the vents, and get below the surface before the sea came in through something that had not closed properly. K-13 sank on trials in the Gareloch in 1917, with her engineering staff still aboard. K-4 and K-17 were rammed and sunk by other British ships during a night exercise in the Firth of Forth in 1918, an incident the Navy called the Battle of May Island and immediately classified. 6 of the 18 K-boats were lost, most not to the enemy. Crews who served in them had a name that required no explanation: the Calamity class. The V-class submarines were the United States Navy's attempt at a true ocean-going fleet submarine in the early 1920s, and the result was a boat that vibrated so severely, crews described the experience as exhausting to operate on long patrols. The diesel engines promised 21 knots and delivered 19 on a good day. Nothing failed catastrophically. The V-boats simply ground their crews down over weeks at sea, until the men came back from patrol more worn than the machinery. The Navy learned from them, abandoned the concept, and left the crews to remember what the experiment had felt like from inside. The torpedo the United States Navy issued to its submarines at the start of the Pacific War was the Mark 14, and it did not work. It ran too deep. Its magnetic exploder triggered prematurely, or not at all. Its contact exploder failed on direct hits. Commander Dudley Morton of USS Wahoo fired 10 torpedoes at a stationary Japanese transport from close range and watched 9 of them fail to detonate. American submarine commanders filed repeated reports of torpedoes striking Japanese hulls and failing to explode. The Bureau of Ordnance resisted the reports for 2 years, insisting the problem was crew error. The submariners being sent to the bottom of the Pacific while headquarters debated had other opinions. The Mark 14's contact exploder was not officially condemned until 1943.
Surkoff was designed to do everything, and the result was a submarine that did nothing well. At 2,800 tons, surfaced she was the largest submarine in the world when commissioned in 1929, carrying a twin 8-inch gun turret, a hangar for a float plane, and a crew of 150 men in a hull that was never quite enough for all of them. Dive times regularly exceeded 2 minutes, dangerously slow for a vessel of her size. Free French officers who served in her after 1940 were candid in their correspondence. One flag officer described her as a floating circus. She disappeared in the Caribbean in February 1942 with all hands. The inquiry was inconclusive. The 10 Type 14 supply submarines built by Germany between 1941 and 1942 were essential to the Atlantic campaign, and every man who served in them understood exactly what that meant. A submarine that resupplied other submarines was a target of the highest priority. Allied codebreakers and patrol aircraft found them systematically. U-459 was sunk in July 1943. U-460, U-461, and U-462 were destroyed within 2 months of each other that same summer. By 1944, reporting to a milk cow meant joining one of the shortest-lived crews in the Kriegsmarine. The I-400 class submarines were 400 feet long, carried 3 aircraft in a watertight hangar, and required a crew of more than 200 men to operate. They were the largest submarines in the world until the Cold War. They were also, for the men who served in them, an experience defined by heat, compression, and institutional futility. The hangar ran the length of the forward deck and generated its own maintenance demands in the tropical waters where the boats operated. The mission the boats had been built to execute, striking the Panama Canal, was cancelled. The replacement missions were smaller, shorter, and no less dangerous. Both surviving I-400s were scuttled by the US Navy in 1946, before Soviet observers could examine them. The Soviet Navy built 12 large Katyusha-class submarines and sent them to the Arctic and Pacific on patrols that tested both the boats and the men inside them. The heating systems were inadequate for Arctic conditions. Condensation formed on every interior surface. Half the class was lost during the war, to enemy action, to mines, and to accidents that Soviet records classified in ways that did not always reflect what had actually happened. K-1 disappeared in 1943 with no confirmed explanation. K-2 was lost to unknown causes the same year. The surviving crews understood that their continued existence owed as much to luck as to engineering. USS Thresher was 9 months out of a major overhaul when she dove to test depth on April 10, 1963, with 129 men aboard. The last intelligible transmission reported a minor flooding problem in the engine room. Then there was a sound that hydrophone operators described as a submarine breaking apart. And then silence. The investigation identified silver-brazed piping joints as a probable failure point, a construction standard that had been approved, applied throughout the boat, and never adequately pressure-tested at operational depth. Thresher was the first nuclear submarine ever lost. She remains in 8,400 feet of water in the North Atlantic. USS Scorpion departed Rota, Spain on May 17, 1968, and was due in Norfolk 10 days later. She never arrived. The Navy searched for 5 months before locating the wreck southwest of the Azores in 9,800 feet of water with 99 men aboard. The official investigation never proved what killed her. What it did establish was that Scorpion had gone to sea with a backlog of unresolved maintenance discrepancies that nobody had fixed before she sailed. The torpedo malfunction theory, that a Mark 37 activated inside the boat, remains the most widely accepted explanation. It has never been confirmed. The 4 Upholder-class submarines were completed between 1990 and 1993, and almost immediately placed in extended readiness as the Royal Navy reconsidered its requirements. Canada purchased them in 1998. HMCS Chicoutimi caught fire on her delivery voyage across the Atlantic in October 2004, killing one officer. The class developed such a reputation for mechanical problems that Canadian crews openly questioned their safety in ways that reached the press and then Parliament. The submarines were eventually returned to operational service. The institutional confidence they were supposed to provide took considerably longer.
K-19 was the Soviet Navy's first nuclear ballistic missile submarine, and she earned her nickname before she completed her first deployment. On July 4, 1961, a coolant pipe in the reactor compartment failed in the North Atlantic. Without cooling, the reactor core would overheat, and the result, in the middle of the ocean, beyond rescue, was not something anyone aboard wanted to consider. Captain Nikolai Zatayev ordered men into the reactor compartment without adequate protective equipment to fabricate and install an emergency cooling system by hand. They worked in shifts. Each man who entered understood what he was entering. 8 died within days. Many suffered radiation-related illness in the years that followed. Zatayev wrote afterward, "I gave them the order to go in. I knew I was sending them to their deaths." K-27 was built around a liquid metal-cooled reactor, a technology that promised higher performance than conventional designs and delivered consequences the Soviet Navy had not fully calculated. On May 24, 1968, a coolant accident filled compartments with radioactive gas. 9 men died in the immediate aftermath. The remainder of the crew received radiation doses that Soviet medical records documented with clinical precision and military secrecy in equal measure. Many suffered radiation-related illness in the years that followed. K-27 was taken out of service, deemed too contaminated to repair, towed to the Kara Sea in 1981, and scuttled with her reactor still aboard. On October 3, 1986, a fuel leak in Missile Tube 6 of K-219 ignited while the submarine was on patrol 600 miles northeast of Bermuda. The fire burned through the missile compartment while the crew fought it. Captain Igor Brithanov later described attempting to reach Soviet command while his boat was sinking with nuclear weapons aboard. The responses he received reflected an institution more concerned with procedure than with the men on the submarine. Seaman Sergei Preminin was ordered into the reactor compartment to manually shut down the reactors as the boat went down. He succeeded. The hatch could not be opened from inside afterward. He was 20 years old. K-219 sank the following day. Preminin received the Hero of the Soviet Union posthumously 4 years later. K-222 holds a record that will probably never be broken. On September 18, 1971, she reached 44.7 knots during speed trials, the fastest a submarine has ever traveled underwater. The titanium hull and reactor plant that made this possible also made her extraordinarily expensive, mechanically complex, and operationally punishing for every crew that served in her. The noise generated at high speed was intense enough to degrade her own sonar. Her crew called her the Golden Fish, a reference to both her cost and the folktale about a magic fish that grants wishes while quietly ruining the life of anyone foolish enough to ask for them. The Typhoon-class submarines were the largest ever built, 48,000 tons submerged, 20 ballistic missiles each, and internal dimensions that turned routine maintenance into an expedition. Crew members who have spoken on record describe the experience of serving aboard them in terms that combine genuine pride with sustained exhaustion. The distances between compartments, the infrastructure required to keep the reactor plant operational, the dependence on a small number of bases equipped to support them. When the Soviet Union dissolved and the budget contracted, that infrastructure began to disappear. Several Typhoons were decommissioned not because they had failed, but because the system required to operate them no longer existed. On June 16, 1955, HMS Sidon was moored at Portland Harbor when an experimental high-test peroxide torpedo in her forward tube detonated without warning. The explosion and fire killed 12 men and sank the submarine at the dock. HTP, high-test peroxide, was a propellant the Royal Navy had been developing for a wakeless torpedo that left no visible track. It was also unstable under conditions that were difficult to predict. The Sidon disaster did not immediately end British HTP development, but it gave every submariner who worked with the weapons a phrase that required no elaboration: the weapon that kills its own crew first.
K-278 Komsomolets was the only submarine ever built with a titanium pressure hull rated for depths exceeding 1,000 meters, deeper than any Western weapon of the period could reliably reach. On April 7, 1989, a fire broke out in her aft compartments while she was operating in the Norwegian Sea. The crew fought it for several hours before the boat went down. 42 men died, most of them in the water afterward. In the Norwegian Sea, in April, waiting 6 hours for rescue that arrived too late for most of them. The titanium hull that had made Komsomolets extraordinary at depth provided no protection against fire, and none at all against the temperature of the North Atlantic in spring. On August 12, 2000, investigators concluded that a leaking practice torpedo triggered the initial explosion aboard Kursk. The blast set off a second detonation, equivalent to several tons of TNT. Kursk sank in 350 feet of water in the Barents Sea, with 118 men aboard. 23 survived the initial blasts in the aft compartments. The Russian Navy waited 4 days before accepting foreign assistance. Norwegian divers opened the escape hatch within hours of being permitted to try. In Compartment 9, Captain Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov had written a note in the darkness. It read in part, "There are 23 people here. We feel bad, weakened by carbon dioxide. I am writing blind." The Plongeur, launched in 1863, was the first mechanically propelled submarine in history, driven by compressed air stored in 23 tanks built into the hull. She was also one of the least manageable vessels anyone had yet put in the water. The compressed air drive made her difficult to hold at a consistent depth, and slow to respond in any direction. She required so much crew effort to operate that the energy available for forward movement was a fraction of what the design implied. No navy copied her propulsion concept. France retired her after 6 years. The technology she pioneered went nowhere. HMSM-1 was built around a 12-inch gun, battleship caliber, on the theory that a submarine could surface, fire one devastating round, and dive before the enemy could respond. The theory was never tested in combat. The gun required surfacing to fire, which removed a significant portion of the submarine's tactical advantage. The dive time after surfacing was dangerously extended by the weight of the turret. In November 1925, M1 was struck by the Swedish merchant vessel Vidar during exercises off Start Point and sank in seconds, taking 69 men with her. The submarine had been considered an experiment. The outcome was not. The Type D submarines were converted cargo carriers, adapted to transport Kai-10, human torpedoes, to their launch positions. The Kai-10 were one-man submarines modified from Type 93 oxygen torpedoes. Piloted by men who understood the mission profile did not include a return leg. The crew of the mother submarine lived alongside them, separated by a few feet of steel, knowing their passengers, knowing their purpose, and knowing that the boat's own survival depended on reaching a position close enough to enemy shipping to make the Kai-10's limited range meaningful. I-361 was sunk by American aircraft in August 1945. None of the Kai-10 attacks launched from her boats achieved confirmed sinkings. The Maru-U submarines were built by the Imperial Japanese Army,
because the Imperial Japanese Navy had refused to provide cargo submarines for Army supply runs to isolated island garrisons. The Army therefore designed and built its own. The results reflected the limits of an institution attempting naval architecture without naval experience. The boats were slow, structurally marginal, and prone to corrosion that followed from inadequate design and rushed construction in tropical conditions. Navy personnel who encountered them recorded their assessments without diplomatic restraint. The Army had built the worst submarines in the Pacific War, and the Imperial Japanese Navy never let anyone forget it. The Type 21 was the most advanced submarine of the Second World War, faster submerged than surfaced, equipped with a snorkel, capable of sustained high-speed underwater runs that no Allied anti-submarine system had been designed to counter. She was also, in the form delivered to her first crews in 1944 and 1945, comprehensively unfinished. The accelerated construction program assembled prefabricated sections from multiple factories and welded them together at the fitting-out yards, producing boats with thousands of uncorrected defects. Crews received revolutionary submarines whose hatches leaked, wiring failed, and hydraulic systems broke before the first war patrol had properly begun. Grand Admiral Dönitz acknowledged in post-war testimony that men had been sent to sea in submarines that were not ready.
The Alpha-class submarines were the fastest and deepest-diving operational submarines the Soviet Union ever built. Powered by a liquid metal reactor that ran on molten lead bismuth coolant, maintained above 125 degrees Celsius at all times. If the coolant temperature dropped and the metal solidified, the reactor could not be restarted without shipyard intervention. This meant the reactor coolant had to remain heated continuously, at sea, in port, during maintenance. Crews could not simply leave the boat. Shore teams maintained heating systems around the clock. When the Soviet naval budget collapsed after 1991, several Alpha-class boats had their reactor coolant freeze solid at the pier. They were never returned to service.